Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Kathy Kwon. I use she, her pronouns. Thank you for having me here today. As Beth sort of referred to, I identify as queer, and I am still well aware that there are still relatively very few places where I'm allowed to preach. So just wanted to say that gratitude is real and it runs deep. I'll say also that, yeah, this is a strange Sunday to preach for me, particularly as an American living in Canada. For so many of us, yes, south of the border, but also here in Canada and really around the world. The last 3 years have been some kind of hell. And also particularly for Black and African descent folks and Indigenous peoples in Canada and the US, so have the last few hundred years. Yes, we are definitely on the precipice of meaningful change triggered by a cascade of things, including the swell of rage following George Floyd's murder and by the Harrison-Biden win announced yesterday. As much as I refuse to take these events lightly, and as much as I insist on hope, I know we also have to accept that simultaneous reality of the historic and therefore current ongoing systemic racism and oppression that has long been the case, again in Canada included. We have to accept the depth and breadth of this ongoing reality, which has become all the more apparent in the last 4 years, and also over the last 4 days. This phenomenon is not new. It is not gone, and it's not uniquely American. And what has taken me way too long to realize is that we actually all have to be at a level of enraged, really, in order for lasting and deeply rooted change to come. That's not just the responsibility of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, but all of us. The injustices that they face, they have to become ours as well. When I was originally preparing to talk today, I felt this kind of apology about making reference to things happening in the US and conditions that are alive and well there. But I realized that suppressing the impulse to speak on these realities would be disingenuous and unhelpful, actually, on my part. Not only because I am an American living in Canada, but more so because of the clear and widespread realities of deeply rooted racism and oppression that Trump's presidency has revealed about all of us, about who we are as people really around the world. Again, Canada, BC, Vancouver included. The city of Vancouver, I'm also in Vancouver. The city of Vancouver has an uninterrupted history of many racisms and oppressions, including against, of course, Indigenous peoples, Black and African descent folks, Chinese, Japanese, East Indians. The list just goes on. And there's these questions, do we know what it means that we live on the specifically unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples? Do we know what that means? Do we know the history of Chinatown, or the Chinese poor in the city, or how far back in history the legacy of current anti-Asian racism in Vancouver actually goes? Do we know about the ship filled with 360, or I think it was 376 Sikhs, Muslims, and Hindus from India that was turned away at the Vancouver port in 1914 due to racialized immigration laws, and the 20 passengers that were shot and killed on that ship who were protesting? Do we know that the KKK had a chapter in Vancouver? It was located in Shaughnessy in the 1920s. That they kidnapped a Chinese servant and tortured him to near death? Do we know about Japanese internment in British Columbia in the 1940s, that all of their businesses, homes, and property were stripped from them by the government, just taken away? They weren't bought, they were just taken. And that the Japanese Hall in Railtown is the first and only piece of property that has ever been returned by the city of Vancouver. And it's been returned to the Japanese community. You know, it's like, what does that even mean? Do we know what happened to Hogan's Alley and the many Black residents who used to live there in the 1970s? Do we know why they're no longer there? Yeah, racism and white supremacy in particular it's a part of Vancouver's legacy, actually. It's a part of who Vancouver has been and who it still is, which means for those of us who live in Vancouver and for those of us who call this city our home, we have a lot of work to do. So I say all of that. I was asked to preach on Amos today. And with all that I've shared so far, I'll read for you Amos chapter 5, verses 21 to 27. And this is the Message version, just for kind of a brain switch. And it reads, I cannot stand your religious meetings. I'm fed up with your conferences and conventions. I want nothing to do with your religion projects, your pretentious slogans and goals. I'm sick of your fundraising schemes, your public relations and image making. I've had all I can take of your noisy ego music. When was the last time you sang to me? Do you know what I want? I want justice, oceans of it. I want righted relationship, rivers of it. That's what I want. That's all I want. Didn't you, dear family of Israel, worship me faithfully for 40 years in the wilderness, bringing the sacrifices and offerings I commanded? How is it you stooped to dragging cheap statues of your so-called rulers around, hauling the cheap images of all your star gods here and there? Since you like them so much, you can take them with you when I drive you into exile beyond Damascus. This is God's message, God of the angel armies. So these verses are what's called a chiasm, which is essentially like a pyramid of verses used to build on an idea and then emphasize the central verse or verses. And the center of this chiasm won't surprise a lot of you. It's one of likely the most popular verses in Amos, namely chapter 5, verse 24. And the non-message version, which you might recognize, is, but let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never failing stream, or more accurately, a mighty torrent of waters. I'm not sure why they use stream here. It's not strong enough. That central verse there uses a very particular description of justice. And it's the Hebrew word there. It's kind of referencing a seasonal torrent of flood waters that would literally cover everything. I mean, what can escape water? And then this additional word, never ceasing or never failing. It's this never ceasing version of then that seasonal flooding of water. And so it's that kind of justice. Let that kind of justice and right relatedness roll in like this never ceasing mighty torrent of flood water. And if I'm honest, in view of everything I shared about at the beginning of this sermon, it's been really difficult for me to figure out what to say today about justice rolling in like that. Like God told the prophet Amos about. I'm someone who typically has a lot of things to say about a lot of things. But I've gotten to that point through a really long and painful process of fighting through silencing, yes, from my own self, but more so from socialization and other people around me. And one thing I've learned as I've learned to use my own voice is that not all voices are treated equally. And today I feel the weight of that reality in a very acute and particular way. Um, I think a significant part of why I've even struggled to know what to say today is because, in some actual material way, I don't know that it's my turn to speak. Not because I don't have something to say or I shouldn't be allowed to speak or something in that kind of like, I don't know, defensive freedom of speech sort of strain, but because there are other voices right now that are just more important. Um, there are countless prophets in our midst today. And I genuinely believe that. And I believe that in a deeply spiritual way. I believe that God has been preparing folks for a moment like this. And today I'm really comfortable saying I'm not one of those people. And I encourage really all of us to think about wherever we are, and whoever we follow. I encourage us to think about what those voices and who those prophets are in this time for us. So what I feel way more comfortable doing is to point a finger. I can shine a light and I can amplify the voices that are calling us to what I hear right now, anger, calling us away from complacency and calling us towards a torrential flooding of justice. The voices that are reminding us that though we may have turned some kind of a corner again, though an awful minion has been taken out of power in a particular way, there is a battle that has been raging for centuries, and that reality has not, absolutely not changed overnight. In fact, it has only been brought to the surface, it's been accentuated, and the reality of our necessary participation has only been made far more stark. We actually cannot any longer in our humanity stand by, nor could we ever have before, in our own ways of what standing by looks like. And as I was reading through Amos, what stood out to me in this set of verses was not simply this kind of contextual rebuke against false religiosity and false rituals. What stood out to me was actually the tone. I can't stand, I'm fed up, I'm sick of. You know, he's angry, with prophetic anger. And that prophetic anger was good and right. And I think in a context where potentially anger is not something that we're comfortable with and perhaps not practiced in exercising and manifesting and expressing well, I think right now there are a lot of beacons of what it looks like to express prophetic anger. So what I thought I'd do for the rest of this talk is to point a finger and to shine a light and to amplify voices calling us to that anger. One from the present day and more recently in the last few months, and one from our past. The first is Kimberly Jones. She's an activist in the States, and she's a Black womanist activist. And I will warn us that she does get very angry. So if that is something that you're uncomfortable with in a way that's maybe triggering, then absolutely I invite you to mute or to mute the video. But if it makes you uncomfortable in a way that invites you into action and into actually owning some of the injustice, then I really encourage you to stick with it. So I'm going to share my screen, and I am going to, this was actually in sort of in the aftermath of a lot of the protests and the protests that then became violent. And there was a bunch of criticism of folks who were looting. And this is in response to that criticism. So I will share this now.
So I've been seeing a lot of things talking of the people making commentary. Interestingly enough, the ones I've noticed that have been making the commentary are wealthy Black people making the commentary about we should not be rioting, we should not be looting, we should not be tearing up our own communities. And then there's been an argument of the other side of we should be hitting them in the pocket. We should be focusing on the blackout days where we don't spend money. But, you know, I feel like we should do both. And I feel like I support both. And I'll tell you why I support both. I support both because when you have a civil unrest like this, there are three types of people in the streets. There are the protesters, there are the rioters, and there are the looters. The protesters are there because they actually care about what is happening in the community. They want to raise their voices, and they are there strictly to protest. You have the rioters who are angry, who are anarchists, who really just want to shit up, and that's what they're going to do regardless. And then you have the looters. And the looters almost exclusively are just there to do that, to loot. Now, people are like, well, what did you gain? Well, what did you get from looting? I think that as long as we're focusing on the what, we're not focusing on the why. And that's my issue with that. As long as we're focusing on what they're doing, we're not focusing on why they're doing. And some people are like, well, those aren't people who are legitimately angry about what's happening. Those are people who just want to get stuff. Okay, well then, let's go with that. Let's say that's what it is. Let's ask ourselves why in this country in 2020, the financial gap between poor Blacks and the rest of the world is at such a distance that people feel like their only hope and only opportunity to get some of the things that we flaunt and flash in front of them all the time is to walk through a broken glass window and get it. That they are so hopeless that getting that necklace, getting that TV, getting that change, getting that bed, getting that phone, whatever it is that they're going to get, is that in that moment when the riots happen and if they present an opportunity of looting, that's their only opportunity to get it. We need to be questioning that why. Why are people that poor? Why are people that broke? Why are people that food insecure, that clothing insecure, that they feel like their only shot, that they are shooting their shot by walking through a broken glass window to get what they need. And then people want to talk about, well, there's plenty of people who pulled themselves up out of bootstraps and got it on their own. Why can't they do that? Let me explain to you something about economics in America. And I'm so glad that as a child, I got an opportunity to spend time at Push where they taught me this, is that we must never forget that economics was the reason that Black people were brought to this country. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Do you understand that? That's what we came to do. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Now, if I right now decided that I wanted to play Monopoly with you, and for 400 rounds of playing Monopoly, I didn't allow you to have any money. I didn't allow you to have anything on the board. I didn't allow for you to have anything. And then we played another 50 rounds of Monopoly, and everything that you gave and you earned while you were playing that round of Monopoly was taken from you. That was Tulsa. That was Rosewood. Those are places where we built Black economic wealth, where we were self-sufficient, where we owned our stores, where we owned our property, and they burned them to the ground. So that's 450 years. So for 400 rounds of Monopoly, you don't get to play at all. Not only do you not get to play, you have to play on the behalf of the person that you're playing against. You have to play and make money and earn wealth for them, and then you have to turn it over to them. So then for 50 years, you finally get a little bit and you're allowed to play. And every time that they don't like the way that you're playing, or that you're catching up, or that you're doing something to be self-sufficient, they burn your game. They burn your cards. They burn your Monopoly money. And then finally at the release and the onset of that, they allow you to play and they say, okay, now you catch up. Now at this point, the only way you're gonna catch up in the game is if the person shares the wealth, correct? But what if every time you share the wealth, then there's psychological warfare against you to say, oh, you're an equal opportunity hire. So if I played 400 rounds of Monopoly with you and I had to play and give you every dime that I made, and then for 50 years, every time that I played, if you didn't like what I did, you got to burn it like they did in Tulsa and like they did in Rosewood. How can you win? How can you win? You can't win. The game is fixed. So when they say, why do you burn down the community? Why do you burn down your own neighborhood? It's not ours. We don't own anything. We don't own anything. Trevor Noah said it so beautifully last night. There's a social contract that we all have, that if you steal or if I steal, then the person who is the authority comes in and they fix the situation. But the person who fixes the situation is killing us. So the social contract is broken. And if the social contract is broken, why the do I give a shit about burning the Football Hall of Fame, about burning a Target? You broke the contract when you killed us in the streets and didn't give up. You broke the contract when for 400 years we played your game and built your wealth. You broke the contract when we built our wealth again on our own, by our bootstraps in Tulsa, and you dropped bombs on us. When we built it in Rosewood and you came in and you slaughtered us. You broke the contract, so your Target, your Hall of Fame. As far as I'm concerned, it could burn this bitch to the ground. And it still wouldn't be enough. And they are lucky that what Black people are looking for is equality and not revenge.
I'm just going to give us a couple minutes or a minute to sit with that. Because I know it makes us uncomfortable and silence makes us uncomfortable, and I think that's good. Not only that set of verses from chapter 5, but I think in the whole prophecy, I think that is in some way materially what Amos was up to, was truth-telling and giving very specific cities and rulers and individuals the opportunity to understand what they were participating in. When I first heard Kimberly Jones speak about what she just did, yeah, it was really difficult to hear that context and to really let what she was saying settle in my body, actually, not just in my mind, oddly enough. And I think I've been in Vancouver for about 13, 14 years, so the vast majority of my adult life. And yeah, it's, I've had to really I've had to learn for the first time what Canada's history has been with its own racial history and particularly colonialism, because I did not learn a lot about colonialism and the American version of it, to be quite frank. and listening to Kimberly through that lens, I could hear an Indigenous person saying almost the exact same thing, except in the Canadian context, and recognizing that the Canadian legacy has affected Indigenous folks in very similar ways, but also in drastically different ways. And doing that work of translation of what her anger translates into the Canadian Indigenous experience, and also the anti-Black experience in Canada as well. There's certainly a legacy of slavery and of structural state violence against Black folks in Canada as well. I'll close this off with the words of from the past, and it's a letter. It's an excerpt from the letter from a Birmingham jail by MLK Jr. And again, I really feel as though this is the call for any of us folks who have a place of privilege, have a seat at certain tables, have a voice that certain folks listen to. It's a call for us to really take that influence seriously, and to be enraged and to stay connected to the injustices that affect people all around us, and for some of us affect us. And he writes, I must make to you honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers and sisters. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that law and order exist for the purpose of establishing justice, and that when they fail in this purpose, they become the dangerously structured dams that block the flow of social progress. I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that the present tension in the South is a necessary phase of the transition from an obnoxious negative peace in which the Negro passively accepted his unjust plight to a substantive and positive peace in which all men will respect the dignity and worth of human personality. Actually, we who engage in nonviolent direct action are not the creators of tension. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. We bring it out in the open where it can be seen and dealt with. And he closes, if I have said anything in this letter that overstates the truth and indicates an unreasonable impatience, I beg you to forgive me. If I have said anything that understates the truth and indicates my having a patience that allows me to settle for anything less than brotherhood and sisterhood, I beg God to forgive me. I hope this letter finds you strong in the faith. I also hope that circumstances will soon make it possible for me to meet each of you, not as an integrationist or a civil rights leader, but as a fellow clergyman and a Christian brother. Let us all hope that the dark clouds of racial prejudice will soon pass away and the deep fog of misunderstanding will be lifted from our fear-drenched communities. And in some not too distant tomorrow, the radiant stars of love and brotherhood will shine over our great nation with all their scintillating beauty. Yours for the cause of peace and brotherhood, Martin Luther King Jr. Amen.
Thank you so much, Kathy. I'm going to invite